and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Melissa Kane. I'm a political and legal analyst and your moderator for today's program. It is my pleasure to introduce our special guest today, Jonathan Alter. He is an award-winning journalist, an author, and a documentary filmmaker. He's a longtime political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC and a former senior editor and columnist at Newsweek. He's one of the few journalists who was allowed in the courtroom during President Donald Trump's criminal trial regarding hush money to Stormy Daniels. And his latest book is American Reckoning: Inside Trump's Trial and My Own. Mr. Alter, thank you so much for being here. Welcome back to the club.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I'm very grateful to the Commonwealth Club. I've been here for my 4 previous books, so it's great to be with you. This book is part trial diary. I was one of the only people in the courtroom all 23 days of the trial. Most of the other reporters had to rotate in and out. And it's part kind of cry from the heart for democracy. And then there's a little bit of my personal story and my development in becoming a journalist.
Yeah, I noticed that this book seems to be more personal. As you point out, this is not your first book, but it does seem to be a little closer to the heart than some of your prior novels.
No question that my earlier books, so I wrote a book about FDR, 2 about Barack Obama, and a biography of Jimmy Carter. And in none of those books did I lapse into the first person. And this one is very kind of emotional for me. And I think whatever happens with the sentencing in this case, whatever happens with Donald Trump in the future, I hope it gives people a kind of a tactile sense of what it felt like to love democracy, be a little bit disillusioned about the good sense of the American people, and be very focused on trying to do whatever we can to hold Donald Trump accountable in whatever fashion we can. So that's really the object of the book, and it ends on a hopeful note.
Well, I'd love to give our viewers and listeners a bit of a preview of what you're including there. So if you've got a couple passages that demonstrate what we're talking about here,
yeah.
I'd love to hear them.
So the first one, so this is from the diary portion of the book, which I started keeping at the beginning of this year. And on the 16th of February, as I was obtaining credentials for this trial, I wrote, do I want to, the entry is called I Have to. Do I want to bring my life to a standstill for weeks or even months to cover this trial? In a funny way, it's not really up to me. I'm going to cover it because I have to. I'm compelled to. I have to, after Trump didn't lift a finger to save the lives of Capitol Police officers, the House Speaker, and his own vice president. I have to, after Kevin McCarthy visited a disgraced Trump at Mar-a-Lago and threw him a lifeline that makes this comeback possible. I have to, after Find Me 11,780 votes, that tape from Georgia, and Trump ruining the lives of election workers with his lies. I have to, after Trump refused to return the nuclear secrets he had stolen and sold out Ukraine and promised to bring, quote, retribution and to, quote, suspend the Constitution. I know he's on trial in New York for different crimes, but he is a career criminal and must be stopped where there is evidence to do so. His crimes against decency and democracy are now so numerous that they blur together and numb us into complacency, which is one more reason I have to slap myself in the face and report for duty. And I'll say, Melissa, I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning in New Jersey to get into New York City to go to this trial. So then I just very briefly want to read you just a couple of paragraphs about Michael Cohen. And this is from when Michael Cohen took the stand in this case. He was obviously the key witness, but it's important to understand he was not the only witness. And the other witnesses all bolstered Cohen's testimony. So there was a mountain of evidence against him that led the jury to convict him on 34 counts. And I think will weigh heavily, that mountain of evidence will weigh heavily in Judge Juan Merchan's decision about the immunity portion of the case and what the sentence will be, if any, and I believe there will be some sentence. So I say Michael Cohen is a cross between a Damon Runyon character and Sammy the Bull Gravano, the squat mobster who brought down John Gotti. Trump says Cohen is a rat. My family and I don't like that term because when we lived at 111th in Amsterdam 30 years ago, the empty lot across the street was the most rat-infested place in New York, according to Spy magazine. Rats are a thing with alters. So I prefer stool pigeon or stoolie. Until he flipped in 2018, Cohen wasn't just Trump's fixer and enforcer. He was one of the biggest pricks in New York. Who can forget the tape that my old Daily Beast colleague Tim Mack made of a 2015 call he had with Cohen? Quote, "I'm going to mess up your life for as long as you're on this frickin' planet," Cohen told him, frigging instead of Cohen's idea of playing nice. So I think that gives you some idea of some of the context and flavor that I try to bring into this book, and the passion with which I wrote it. I sort of wrote it in a kind of a fever dream, and most of the book was written in 5 weeks this past summer, and I'd spent 5 years on my biography of Jimmy Carter. So that gives you a sense of how I felt like a sort of an atom had been split inside me, releasing all kinds of energy that I shouldn't really have as somebody who's 67 years old. But I had it, and it was born of an intense feeling that I think a lot of listeners and viewers share.
Well, the color and the detail that you bring, because the trial wasn't televised, is just one of my favorite parts of the book. Your observations and the way you paint a really vivid picture. And I definitely want to get to a couple of other really really fun vignettes as well. But before we sort of dive in, I do want to bring things up to sort of today, November 18th, and talk about where we are with the, let's call it the hush money trial, where there was a guilty verdict back in May. Bring us up to where we are today with regard to the case.
So Trump has introduced many, many motions to dismiss this case, but his election, presented some new things for the judge to weigh, and the prosecution filed a motion asking for until tomorrow, the 19th, to respond on how the judge should weigh what the prosecution calls the competing interests of the jury verdict and, quote, the office of the president. I don't think they really are competing interests, except in a very narrow sense. Jury verdicts are part of democracy too, and the president would not be inconvenienced by appealing this sentencing. Maybe he'd have to talk, for an hour to his lawyers at most about their appeals of any sentence. So it's not like the concern that the Supreme Court had about presidents being tied up with lawsuits when they're in office, and that's at the root of their immunity decision and their regrets over civil suits that are filed against presidents. And so it's not at all clear to me that, in fact, I don't believe that Judge Merchan will throw this out based on the Supreme Court immunity decision. And I also don't believe that Judge Merchan will dismiss the case on other grounds. So I don't know for sure, this is speculative, but I think that he will move forward with sentencing of some kind. And my prediction is, and this is not really worth anything, like a lot of predictions by journalists, we're always asked what's going to happen, and it's like predicting the stock market. But my prediction, for what it's worth, is that he will sentence him to probation, since he's a first-time offender, it could have been jail time. I think if he had been defeated by Kamala Harris, I think it would have been more likely that he would get jail time. That's not really likely at this point, I don't think, partly based on what Merchan said to him when he cited him for contempt of court 10 times during the trial. And he said, Mr. Trump, I will jail you if you reoffend, which Trump didn't do. But I don't want to, because I understand the complexities of jailing a former president. And so my sense is that he'll get what's called a suspended sentence that he will start serving on January 21st, 2029, if he's unable to get it removed on appeal. And there are different views on whether a New York appellate court or the U.S. Supreme Court would throw this out. I just remind people that there's a kind of a fatalism about the Supreme Court because they've had these horrible decisions. But in all 60 of the cases that Trump brought after the 2020 election, Supreme Court declined to review them, all of them. And there are literally dozens of other cases where there were rulings against the Trump administration 4 years ago that the Supreme Court declined to review, or in some cases ruled against the Trump administration. So this idea that they're always a rubber stamp is just not right on the facts. That doesn't mean they might not intervene on his behalf this time, find a reason to do so, but it's not a sure thing that they will back up Trump.
Well, and as a state case, he can't pardon himself in
That is correct. He cannot pardon himself. And for the Supreme Court to interfere in a state conviction, basically to overturn that conviction, that happens sometimes, but not really that often. They have to have a good constitutional reason to do that.
Certainly after a jury trial finding, it seems like there's some higher level of respect after a full trial, as opposed to sort of a technicality appeal early on in a case. Once the jury's rendered a verdict, very hard to undo.
So, and we already did this book is partly about what I call provisional accountability. Starting at the very beginning of the trial, when Judge Merchan said, Mr. Trump, sit down. And then every time Trump, 8 times a day, he would have to kind of lumber, he's a overweight guy, sort of a little trouble getting out of his seat to stand up and honor the jury as they came in and out of the courtroom. This was one of the most inspiring parts of the trial for me, is that the former president, who had never been held to account for anything, never had to answer to anybody since his father died 30 years ago, he had to stand up and show respect for that jury. And they would march in just a few feet away from him, in and out of the courtroom. Almost never, only one of them ever looked at him. They were soldiers for justice. They were there to do their job. They were extraordinarily responsible about it. Of course, now, for understandable reasons, none have come forward to write books or anything, which is why mine is the only record of this trial, because they, understandably would fear for their lives and their safety. So there were many inspiring things that took place in this courtroom. I don't want to have people feel that, because these other trials were dismissed, that, he totally got away with everything. He was convicted and he was brought to heel every day by the judge in this courtroom.
Well, and you point out that it's just unfathomable to think of somebody like Vladimir Putin, for example, sitting down and standing up and having to be quiet or speak or act based on the directions of a judge in any context. And so there is something incredible about watching the former president or even president-elect, having to sort of obey those kinds of orders. It really brings into focus the exceptionalism.
Yeah. And I think that people think, because it was a highly publicized trial, oh, I know what happened with Stormy Daniels. She testified. This was high drama. This is a woman, a very sharp businesswoman who is giving it to Donald Trump for hours on end from the stand, and he can't change the channel to Fox, you know? He can't even drink a Diet Coke. It's water only in the courtroom. And, so he just has to sit there and take it day after day after day, 23 days. And it started with jury selection, where, in trying to get jurors dismissed, Trump's lawyers would quote back these tweets from jurors from years ago where they would say, Trump is the devil and this kind of thing. And Trump had just had to sit there and listen to all of that. So, I mean, there was even if this case is entirely thrown out, which I don't think it will be, there was a rough justice that went on every day, all 23 days.
Well, and I'm so glad that you kept a journal, because as I was reading the book and going through your journal pages, I was it's so funny how time is so warped these days. There are so many things I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. Things that we've forgotten because every day just seems like a whole new avalanche of facts to master, that that even for you, even going back and rereading your journal entries, were you reminded of things that you yourself had forgotten about, things that were important at the beginning of the case or during jury selection or during certain testimony?
Yeah. And, we all get numb to Trump's crimes. And so I thought it was important to, in a short book, just make sure that pretty much everything he did, it's horrible. And the list is quite long. I'm not talking about what he did as president, as much as just his many brushes with, civil accountability. I mean, the judge who found that he had committed what was defined as rape, even though it was a civil case. So I don't have detailed descriptions of all those cases, but in that case, in the E. Jean Carroll case, I happen to know the key witness in that case on E. Jean Carroll's behalf. And, so I talked to her about what it was like being on the stand and being deposed in that case. So I have some of these other cases that I bring in, and then a lot of it is me contextualizing him as a president because, I mostly in my years at Newsweek, I've interviewed 9 of the last 10 American presidents, all except Reagan, either before, during, or after they left office. And I bring almost all of them in one way or another.
Well, your book came out before the election, and of course, since the election, we know what happened. You wrote in the book, in the introduction, if Trump wins the election, this book will be in the tradition of William L. Schreier's Berlin Diary, which chronicles what it felt like to watch Adolf Hitler consolidate his power after he overcame a criminal conviction to become the dictator of Germany. Now that Trump has won re-election, what are your thoughts on how this all fits in, and whether this is no longer the black swan as you write about?
Yeah. So I actually have a section of the book about Trump and Hitler. And I mentioned that, journalists for my whole career have been really reluctant to go there with the Hitler comparison. It's almost like a cliche, but it's Trump who keeps bringing it up, or having, dinner with Nazis, or saying, to John Kelly that, at least Hitler had loyal generals, which is not actually true. They tried to kill him toward the end. But, it's Trump who keeps bringing up Hitler. And it's General John Kelly and General Mark Milley who used the F word, fascist, So I'm fine with going there with the Hitler comparison. Now, whether he ends up going down that road and whether it really is William Schreier's Berlin Diary, that depends on all of us. So democracy has been dented in this election. It has not been destroyed. And its future is very much about us. And to give a sense of that, I make reference to something that Franklin Roosevelt did at the end of his first 100 days, which was the subject of my first book. And after the passage of the National Recovery Act, and we were trying to come out of the Great Depression, he asked Americans to hang a decal in their windows. And the decal had a blue eagle on it. And underneath it said, "We do our part." So I think the question that we all have now is, what is our part in protecting our democracy? And for me, it's bearing witness. And I tell a story about an interview I did with Richard Nixon that reflects on why I felt that was my role, bearing witness, one of the reasons I covered the trial and continue to write. For other people, it might be building a pro-democracy movement with organizing and contributing, or supporting investigative journalism, which can have an accountability function, contributing to candidates at not just the federal level, but state and local level. Because if you can build democracy at the local level or keep it alive in the states by staying active, then you can build or contribute to a bulwark against Trump's encroachments on our democracy, which are already beginning. So the point is, we can't approach this with dread. We can't check out. We'd like to check out, Melissa. I understand why everybody would like that. But, I want to just quickly tell you the story that I opened the book with. And it involves my late father, who was a college student at Purdue University when Pearl Harbor was hit. And he was having a good time in college. He had what they used to call in the 40s, like a swell convertible. And he had a girlfriend who was not my mother. But he didn't get to choose when he left home to fight for democracy. History chose him. And so he enlisted. He flew 31 harrowing combat missions in a B-24. He was shot down over Hungary. And George H.W. Bush, who I covered and interviewed in 1988, he did the same thing after Pearl Harbor. He enlisted and he fought in the Pacific and was shot down. And one of the things, we all have regrets. One of my regrets is that I wrote in Newsweek in 1988. I in print, snickered a little bit when Bush said that when he was in the life raft waiting to be picked up, he didn't know whether he'd be rescued, eventually was by submarine, that he was thinking about the U.S. Constitution. I was like, yeah, sure. I'm a little bit ashamed of that now, because this is a guy who I disagreed with on a lot of things, but he went off and he answered the call to protect democracy. So none of the rest of us have to risk our lives like my dad or George H.W. Bush. We just have to do what we can to do our part.
I was a poll worker on election day, and I got assigned to a poll in San Francisco terms, really far from where I live. It's not the biggest city, but it's on the other side. And I just remember sort of rolling my eyes, and then I thought, oh gosh, well, my dad went to Vietnam, and the least I can do is go across town and do what I can
reaction. That really is. It doesn't mean you have to totally uproot your lives or, but you do have to stay engaged. I know that's become kind of a platitude, but when democracy is on the line, which I believe it is, and when you grasp the stakes, which I believe everybody listening today does, then you have to act. And you can take a little while for self-care, you get your energy back after the election. But then at a certain point, next year, you have to really think about what you can do. And that can take a lot of different forms.
What did you do? Did you grab a bottle of brown liquor, or did you
or
what did you after you found out about the election?
Well, I went on the Lincoln Project program, and with Bill Kristol and Sarah Longwell, who invited me on, and we just started the process of trying to figure out what it meant. And then I have a Substack newsletter called Old Coats, and I decided to wait a week and kind of marinate in the whole thing. And then I wrote a pretty long piece about the 10 reasons I gave for Trump's victory. I'm not a believer in sort of monocausal explanations to to most events. But I do have to say that this will sound a little bit like the grandfather story that it is, that on election day, I was babysitting with my wife for our two granddaughters, and our nearly 3-year-old granddaughter and I were sort of taking a nap together. And I was dozing because I knew I was going to have a long night. And I kind of sensed that she wasn't. And I opened my eyes and she was just staring at me with the biggest smile on her face, like right in my eyes. And it was almost like an epiphany for me. And I realized after the election, like, I just have to think about her and her sister and not get caught up in my own disappointment and disillusionment.
Oh, that's really lovely. That's a great grandpa story. Yeah. Well, one of the things that a number of people have talked about in the postmortems, as much as we've had them since the election, is the decision for Joe Biden to run for a second term and the decision to replace him with Kamala Harris. I mean, there's all sorts of speculation around President Biden and sort of how that went down. I wanted to point out, I did go check. I see this is from January 2023. This is your article in the New York Times. Oh, Biden, what have you done? And it's really about, and to remind everybody, I had forgotten myself about the documents that were found near his Corvette, his
Right.
fancy retro car. But you were saying, now you're sort of taking some of the wind out of the classified documents issue for Donald Trump by doing this yourself. And then at the end, you say, what if you didn't run? And this is January 2023. And I looked at the comments, you were pretty well pilloried for that in the comments. But you were first to say, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea.
Well, I think there were a number of people who were early on this. And I wrote it a few other times on Old Goats on Substack. I wrote an intervention, what that would be like. I did sense that it was disastrous for him to run again, preposterous almost on its face to have an American president in his late 80s, which he would have been at the end of his second term. And, I reflected on some of my conversations with Jimmy Carter, where he said, no president should be over 80. And I thought it was selfish, even though I didn't think he had committed a crime with these documents in his garage, because he gave them back, unlike Trump. The crime was Trump not giving them back, which Biden did. So I didn't think the two cases were that comparable, but for a lot of other reasons. And then on the night of the debate on June 27th, I stayed up all night and wrote a short article for the New York Times about how they needed to throw the process open and Biden needed to withdraw and have what they call a blitz primary. And I outlined how that could work. But it took Biden another 3 weeks, more than 3 weeks, before he finally withdrew. And that was only because of the political brilliance of Nancy Pelosi. And so I tell this story for the first time in this book of how Nancy Pelosi did that. And the process that she undertook to get him off the ticket. It would be obviously more historically significant if Harris had won. Now it's more of a footnote, but I think it's an interesting example of the way a master politician operates. And of course, I think everybody agrees that if she hadn't done that, that instead of losing by, it looks like Harris, when all the votes are counted, is going to lose by like 2.5 points at most. Biden would have lost by 6 or 8 points. I don't think anybody disagrees with that, except maybe somebody who works for Joe Biden and they don't have any leg to stand on, given that how much the association with Biden hurt Harris.
Well, Pelosi, and it's a really interesting story, and I don't want to spoil it too much, but this, the story was that she said something like, you have to make a decision, right? And that's what she told, that's what they asked. They said, what did you say to Joe Biden? She goes, I just told him he needs to make a decision. But there was something so, make him an offer he can't refuse. Like there was something kind of like, you need to make a decision. That was
so it was a little bit different than that, without some of the very colorful details. And I'll give you one, like she was upset that the men were missing in action, the men being Clinton, Obama, Jeffries and Schumer, and that she had to, you know, somebody very close to her said, that basically she was wondering why were hers the only bloody fingerprints on the knife. But she didn't actually say you have to make a decision. She went and secretly to the White House and said, I'm here for you. We've known each other a long time. I just want to listen to you and your thought process about this. She didn't make any recommendation or press him in any way. And then that opened a channel and they talked. And then she pursued an outside strategy. So she went on Morning Joe and said President Biden hasn't made his decision yet, which wasn't actually correct, since he had said, only God Almighty could get him to change his mind. And it wasn't really true that he hadn't made his decision. Maybe he'd left a little tiny bit of wiggle room. But the rest of the quite colorful details are in American Reckoning.
Well, and you also talk about the role of Jill Biden, right? You have these two women on either side, and the importance of the first lady in making make decisions around.
I don't think history. I mean, Jill Biden is a terrific woman. She was an excellent first lady, and Joe Biden was an excellent president. He just wasn't the right candidate, and he's never been a good candidate. I've covered him since 1988. I know him, interviewed him many times, and he's just never been a good candidate. He kept finishing 5th and 6th in the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary every time he'd run. And Jill Biden, though, will not be well regarded by history, unfortunately. So in 1952, Bess Truman advised Harry Truman not to run. He was entitled to run again. And in 1968, Lady Bird Johnson advised Lyndon not to run again. Jill Biden did not make that decision, that same decision. If she had, if the Democrats had nominated a governor of either sex, that person would now be the president-elect. I'm convinced of it. That governor would not be burdened by inflation and immigration and all the other sort of weights of the Biden administration on Kamala Harris, who ran an excellent campaign, but she was just burdened down by this, and that would not have been a problem, and it would have been much easier for people to vote for the outsider governor, which is how, Clinton and Reagan and Bush Jr., they all were governors, and Jimmy Carter. America likes governors, not people connected to Washington when they're voting for president. So it's tragic. I think there was a false assumption there was nobody out there. But that's what primaries are for. Somebody would have emerged, and after they did, they would have been a very strong nominee, and they would not have taken the country off the left edge, as some people feared, because both Sanders and Warren were also too old to run for president. And I don't think that Ro Khanna or another self-described progressive would have been the nominee. It would have been somebody else, Gretchen Whitmer or another governor or somebody. And that's all in the coulda, shoulda category. And there's nothing that can be done about it, but all of that will factor into an assessment of Joe and Jill Biden and what they did.
Well, yes, a very bittersweet "I told you so" on that. I'm sure you would have maybe preferred not to be right on your assessment of Joe Biden. But I do want to turn to the trial a bit. We've got a couple of audience questions here. The first question is, what was the thing that most surprised or shocked you while watching the trial?
I think this is, I was surprised by how much of the time Trump was either dozing or asleep. That caught me by surprise. It started early, but I thought, it started during jury selection. I thought, well, okay, he was tired, whatever. But he was asleep, or at least had his eyes closed, by my count, for close to a third of the testimony, including critical testimony by Michael Cohen and others. And, Part of it is no Diet Coke, but I think part of it is just that he wasn't used to getting up as early as he had to go to court, and he's a night owl. I don't know what the explanation is, but that surprised me. Then I was also really surprised by what a poor defense they put on, and it was led by Todd Blanche, who's now going to be the deputy attorney general. He will be confirmed, unlike Gates. And so Blanche is a smart enough guy, but he was very inexperienced. He's a former federal prosecutor who had only tried a portion of 2 cases for the defense, and repeatedly he made a series of dumb mistakes. And the dumbest, which I think he did, like a lot of the things he did at the direction of Donald Trump, was when the prosecution rested, Trump had a decision: do we put on any case? And we knew by then that he wasn't going to testify in his own defense. He was essentially going to take the fifth. But we sort of thought that he would not call any witnesses and argue, as attorneys often do, look, they haven't proven their case, and we'll just keep it clean, and we're not even going to make an assumption that they have. We're just going to not call any witnesses. But they ended up calling this guy named Robert Costello, who is a Rudy Giuliani buddy. And he had testified during the second to last week of the trial on Capitol Hill about what a scoundrel Michael Cohen was. So Trump said, oh, get him to do that in court, right? So he went into, he testified. He was the only witness, with one exception of a very, very minor kind of clerical witness, for Trump. And from the start, he was so arrogant that he thought he was the judge. And he would say from the witness chair, strike that, like he was the judge. It was nuts. And then he would say, stand closer to the microphone. He'd say to the prosecutor, like he was the judge. And then he started staring down the judge. And the judge dismissed the jury. And he said, are you trying to stare me down? And Costello didn't really answer him. And he continued to try to stare him down. And then the judge said, clear the court, which the lawyers and former judges who were spectators who I was hanging out with, they'd never seen it in like 40 years of practice. They'd never seen a judge clear the courtroom. So there was bedlam in the courtroom. And like, what are we supposed to leave? Like, what's going on here? And the guards are saying, leave, clear the court, go, go, go. You know, and
that is some TV stuff. It's one of these things
this would have been,
that doesn't really happen.
No. And so meanwhile, like representatives of the press are yelling at the judge, you know, this isn't right, this isn't fair, we protest. And then the judge, who's a good, wise judge, I'm not sure he should have done this, but he says, okay, everything that I say now will be in the transcripts. So the press will have an opportunity to see what I say. And then he just tongue lashed the witness, Robert Costello, and just basically read him the riot act and said that he would hold him in contempt of court if he didn't change his behavior. And it was, you know, it was very, very dramatic. Not as dramatic as that last moment when the jury foreperson, you know, just maybe 15, 20 feet away from me is going, guilty, guilty, guilty 34 times. And in his Irish brogue, he was an Irish American. And, you know, I've covered a lot of really, really compelling stories in my 40 years in this business. And this was right up there in terms of the drama of what unfolded.
Well, and I love the detail that you guys got to take with you. You couldn't have your cell phones out, but you could have binoculars.
Yeah.
That's so wild.
That was wild. That's another surprise that they let us use binoculars. So as long as you weren't seeing folk, and there were guards on either side in the aisles, like staring at you all the time to make sure that you didn't pull out your cell phone. So for instance, when a reporter named Olivia Nuzzi, who's become kind of well known lately. Before the trial started, I think during jury selection, she pulled out her cell phone and took a picture, and she was permanently ejected from the courtroom. So they were really, really tough about. She was in the overflow room at the time, permanently ejected from the trial. They were really tough about that, but they had these rules. So you could use binoculars as long as you were not focusing them on the computers of the defense or the prosecution or court personnel, because then they thought you might see something that related to legal strategy or an exhibit that hadn't been introduced. But you could use them to focus on the judge, on the monitor where you could see Trump from the front, see whether he's sleeping, on the jury. And I spent a lot of time looking at juror number 2 because he was the great hope that the Trump team had. He sort of looked a little Trumpy, and they misinterpreted something that he'd said in jury selection, that he was on Truth Social. Actually, what he said was he monitored Truth Social on Twitter the same way he did liberal accounts. So they were engaged in some wishful thinking, but there was concern that this guy might lead to a hung jury. So I would like stare at him all the time. And a couple of times he'd stare back at me like, "What are you looking at? Like, I'm not an animal in the zoo." And I'm like, "Sorry, binoculars are permitted." I didn't say that, but I didn't feel like I had enormous respect for the jury, but that didn't lead to me not using my binoculars on them.
Well, I mean, you got to pass the time too during the day. But to be a juror and to look out into the gallery where people are sitting and to see people, sort of with binoculars must have been really wild, wild
Well,
experience.
also, I mean, they're seeing all these presidential candidates, actually vice presidential candidates, because they all came in, they wore red ties, and they sitting in the front row, auditioning to be on the ticket. J.D. Vance was there, Vivek Ramaswamy. I could go down the list, people from the Hill. And so the jurors would see those guys trooping in too. But I do believe that they took their responsibilities seriously. And I could tell that from the 2 requests they made when they were deliberating. They wanted to hear David Pecker's testimony, which Pecker, who had been the head of the National Enquirer, a really, I think, pretty sleazy guy, but his testimony was, I thought of him as like a well-tailored hyena, His testimony, though, was devastating to Trump. But it was very early in the trial. And so, 6 weeks later, the jurors wanted to make sure that they understood the incriminating part of his testimony. So they asked it to be reread while they were deliberating. And then they also wanted to hear the judge's instructions because they were complicated. And so they did take their responsibility seriously. There's part of the testimony by Hope Hicks, who was Trump's communications director, that under the Supreme Court decision will probably be stripped out of this case. But there was so much other evidence against Trump that it's not like one of those cases where the key testimony is exempted from consideration, is stricken from the case. And so I could be wrong, but I don't think that Judge Merchan will dismiss this case based on the Supreme Court's decision in the immunity case.
How would probation work if you were to get probation? I mean, how does that work when you're
a former president?
picturing the president with an ankle monitor,
former president. So they can't, there's no way that he's going to serve any sentence of any kind while he's president. So the options are, a friend of mine, Tim Noah, suggested that Merchan send him to Rikers Island right now for a week. It won't interrupt the transition that much, and just be done with it. And Alan Weisselberg, who Trump's chief financial officer of the Trump Organization, Merchan was the judge in his case, and in another case involving Weisselberg, he was sent to Rikers Island, where I think he still is. He was during the hush money trial. So it's not, and many people, the New York Times did a study where they found that, quite a number of people convicted of what Trump was convicted of did do a few months in jail. That's, I think, highly unlikely at this point, and none of it can be applied after January 20th of next year for 4 years. The courts are pretty clear on that. So this would be what they call a suspended sentence. There's no statute of limitation or anything like that. In fact, suspended sentences are very common after his appeals are exhausted. And if they rule against him on appeal in the next couple of years, and it'll take a couple of years to play out. And if the verdict is upheld on appeal and the sentencing is upheld on appeal, then I think, he would probably not have an ankle bracelet, but he would, as a former president, if he's still alive in 2029, he would have to report to a probation officer to finish his sentence, to serve his sentence. This is little known, after the conviction, when you're a convicted felon, you already have to have a review with a probation officer, which he did, and it was not publicized. It wasn't a matter of public record. But he has already met with a probation officer in preparation for sentencing. That happened in late June, after sometime in June. The verdict was on May 30th. So sometime in the month of June, he met quietly with a probation officer, and nothing about it ever came out.
Well, and it seems like can you imagine on the rotation, your name is next on the list and you have to go,
Yeah.
all right, your new assignment.
That was in preparation for what they call a sentencing memo, where this court officer, I'm not sure they're actually technically called a probation officer, who has interviewed him about his, state of mind, then writes a memo to the judge to be dealt with at sentencing. But what happened was the Supreme Court ruled in the immunity case, and Judge Mershon then ruled that he would delay sentencing from when it was supposed to take place in early July.
Well, and now it looks like Jack Smith is not going to pursue the federal cases.
That case is dead. Yeah.
And now the final remaining one is the Georgia election interference case that has been on hold, I think, for the State Court of Appeals put it on hold while they were trying to figure out what to do about the Fannie Williams issue. And so we don't really know what's going to happen there. So the point is, this trial, for, as kind of weird and wild as it was, may be the only one that he ever sort of sits for and deals with criminally in the criminal context.
I think that's the likelihood, but he could reoffend as president, and if his track record is any indication, he might. And so if those were part of his unofficial duties, he could conceivably be subjected to criminal prosecution later. But I think you're right that in all likelihood, this will be the only form of accountability, legal accountability in the criminal justice system that he faces. In Georgia, it's quite possible that he'll be severed from the other defendants who will be prosecuted once Fani Willis gets back on track. But he cannot be tried while he is president. And so I think you'll see at a certain point, it's going to take a long time to wend its way through the courts. She made a mistake in having an affair with somebody on her staff that slowed things down. That's a kind of an iffy thing. Trump can go into federal court and try to get an injunction. He has a number of legal. It's easier to stop a trial before it starts than to get it thrown out, which is what is the situation with the hush money election interference case. And speaking of election interference, one of the things I think people don't understand is that this was an effort. What came out, a lot of stuff came out at trial that did not get very much attention. This was an effort to interfere in the 2016 election. So we all know about his efforts in 2020, but this was a conspiracy to affect the outcome of the 2016 2016 election, and with a lot of colorful, in some cases, sexy details involved.
Well, in your book, you seem convinced that had the public known, given what had just come out about the Access Hollywood tape, if this had come out when initially it was going to, sort of without the cover up, without the hush money payment, that it would have affected the election. But given that, given all the public knows now, and there was still a reelection of Donald Trump, do you still believe that? Do you still believe that there's really anything that that can dissuade folks from voting for him?
That's a very good point. I mean, his "I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue" applies, but Hillary won the popular vote pretty comfortably. And remember, after Access Hollywood, a bunch of Republicans were jumping ship, right? And Trump said, we found out in the trial, it was on the advice of Melania, it was locker room talk. If in the couple of weeks following that, if instead of the story being about Hillary's emails, if it had been about Stormy Daniels going on television and saying this was not locker room talk, this happened, we had this affair, and his wife, and then his wife was pregnant when he had affair isn't the right word, when he had sex with Stormy Daniels, he was cheating on his mistress, Karen McDougal, who was a very big part of the testimony. So if that had all come out just before the 2016 election, and remember, Trump was reeling after Access Hollywood, and if it had been a sort of a double whammy, I still think, despite the Fifth Avenue idea, I still think that he would have lost, but we'll obviously never know for sure. And his durability is part of the story, and why I used to describe myself as an idealist without illusions, which is how JFK described himself. And I now realize I had more illusions about the good sense of the American voter than I thought I did. And that obviously was reinforced by what happened on November 5th.
Right, one of the questions here from the audience is, were you surprised at some of the voting groups that heavily supported and voted for President Trump over their participation and support in the 2020 election?
So it's important to remember that heavily it's a very good question, but it's probably not the right word, because Trump did 1 point better among African Americans. And he did significantly better among Latinos. That was really, I think, huge. But in most areas, he didn't win a majority of Latinos. And so they are now up for grabs. And this is one of the big stories of the election. And there are all kinds of reasons why. But I did not. I knew there was going to be some erosion in the Latino vote, but I didn't realize it would be as significant as it was. I was struck by the comments of a Allentown, Pennsylvania radio talk show host, Latino, after the election. And he was recounting how he got call after call from male listeners saying that it was just a cultural thing. They just didn't think that a woman could handle herself in the world as president. And, my reaction to that was, well, Mexico just elected a Jewish woman president, and they voted for Hillary Clinton. And his response to that was, well, in 2016, his listeners said they were voting for Hillary Clinton, many of them, because she had Bill behind her, and they didn't have that this time. So I don't know how much of a factor that was. I think a lot of it is that the Latino vote is becoming blended into the white vote in the way that the Italian American vote, the Irish American vote, and other ethnic voting blocks in the 20th century, they just eventually became part of the white vote. And I think that's now starting to happen with Latinos, and it's a wild card. But anybody who says this was a landslide or realigning election, it just wasn't. It just means that Latino voters are up for grabs. Black voters understandably do not want anybody taking their votes for granted. And Democrats are going to have to just work harder rather than relying on their traditional sources of support. There is my book is called American Reckoning, and I talk about Trump's reckoning with the verdict and my own reckoning with my disillusionment and the reckoning that the American people had on November 5th. And I think there's a fourth reckoning, and that's inside the Democratic Party. And that will take place over the next few years. And it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. I thought the fact that San Francisco, has a new mayor, a more moderate mayor, is an interesting sign in itself. Politics is always changing. And, I think that you can discern a little bit of a shift to the right in the country as a whole and a shift to the center in Democratic areas. And we'll see how that plays out. But it also sometimes cuts in a more progressive way, because I think a lot of people feel that if Harris had been a little sharper on behalf of working people against Wall Street, it might have broken through a little more. She did have critical things to say about billionaires, but what populism wasn't central to her campaign. So it might be that progressive populism gets a little bit of a boost from this. I do think there's going to be a reassessment on some of these cultural issues by Democrats, because it hurt Harris. And it's just a terrible thing when you see the trans community exposed to this kind of ridicule and discrimination. But the truth is, it hurt badly. Demagoguery does work. And that ad that ended, Kamala Harris is for they, them, President Trump is for you. They put well over $100 million into those ads, and they were effective.
I live in San Francisco, and even I saw the ad and I thought, why are you running this? Why would you run this here? What a total waste. What a total waste of money. We all know where the 55 electoral college votes in California are going.
I was wondering that as well. But what they were doing was, if they hadn't run those in California, I think the Democrats would have control of the House now, because they were expecting to pick up a few seats in New York and California. They got 2 in New York. A lot of the California results are still to be determined, but nobody believes that they're going to get control. And part of that is because those Republican candidates did so much better than expected. And part of that is because they were running these ads nationally in football games and elsewhere. But for people who are out like knocking on doors in Nevada or Arizona, or calling into those states, or giving money for a ground game, there's been a lot of, Jon Stewart was guilty of this. There's been a lot of wrong punditry that it didn't do any good. Actually, it did a lot of good, because Harris lost by a much smaller margin in battleground states than she did in non-battleground red states. And as a result, and purple states, as a result, we're going to have in all likelihood, a 53-47 Republican majority instead of a 57-43 if people hadn't gotten involved in this ground game. At 57-43, that would have condemned Democrats to minority status in the Senate for a decade. And now this is a hole that Democrats can actually dig out of. And part of it is a result of the money and time and effort that people put into the Harris campaign, which helped down ballot candidates.
Well, are you concerned at all that there's an easy path here, and I say easy in air quotes, but there's a path here where you just sort of become, not you, but the royal you, become part of the resistance, and then that sort of brushes over the kind of introspection that is needed in this moment, or the kind of thing that maybe some donors are calling for, that you sort of go into emergency mode instead of doing that reflection that doesn't seem to have happened in a really deep way after 2016. Are you confident that will happen versus just sort of gearing up for the next administration?
I'm not confident that anything is going to happen, Melissa. Um, but I do think that, you know, introspection is necessary. And, you know, I would recommend that people consider moving away from identitarianism, identity politics, and that this idea of like, which the Democrats have done for a long time, of building a coalition of different groups, both interest groups and racial, ethnic groups, that this is no longer really a winning strategy. And I think Harris made great strides. You know, her convention had very little identity politics in it. But in 2019, she filled out this questionnaire from the ACLU that was disastrous. And I don't see why Democrats should ever fill out litmus test kind of questionnaires. They can answer on, you know, issues, and they should answer in as specific ways as possible. But these yes/no questions are simplistic and they're harmful. And you know, when I interview politicians, I never say yes or no. I mean, it's not just hostile, it's kind of stupid. And we need to have a little bit more respect for complexity. And I think Democrats should recognize that. But I do want to say, I think that Kamala Harris ran a terrific campaign. I mean, I could nitpick a couple of things. You know, maybe she should have done a little more to separate herself from Biden. But in general, she ran a first-rate campaign that she should be proud of. And there's a lot to learn from her campaign. You know, when somebody loses, people tend to think, oh, everything they did was wrong. You know, that wasn't true of her campaign. There was a lot that she did that was right, the Democrats can build on. But they do just need to be less. I think my main recommendation to Democrats, and in the book I talk about growing up as a Democrat in Chicago, and, you know, I met Martin Luther King came to my house when I was 8 years old. My parents were really active Democrats in the civil rights movement. My mother became the first woman elected to public office in the Chicago area. So I was steeped in Democratic politics, and I know a lot of Democratic politicians. And I guess my recommendation would be to eliminate a characteristic that is too common all over in both parties, but I think especially in the Democratic Party, and that is umbrage. Umbrage, taking offense. You know, if you want to win, which is the purpose of a political party, virtue signaling, showing that you're right, expanding the Overton window, that's not what political parties are for. They're to win so that you can then change people's lives for the better. And so to do that, Democrats have to get tougher and smarter and not lead with their chin. And a lot of times they're leading with their chin on things that are just not politically popular outside of the Bay Area. And I hate to say that, but it's just true. Like, you know, and so I support the idea, just to give a quick example that's very common. I support the ideas behind defund the police, that there needs to be a total rethinking of policing. But if it had been called reform the police with the same agenda, instead of defund the police, which is just politically malpractice, you know, we would be in a better place now, even though this year there was a Democratic congressman who lost in New York because several years ago he had embraced that concept of defund the police. The Republican ran ads against him on this. So Democrats just have to be smarter, more tolerant of dissenting views. So Democrats are for tolerance. They also have to be tolerant of people who maybe they make mistakes. Maybe they don't always use the right pronouns and so forth, you know, and to just be a little bit more forgiving of people and inclusive in a larger sense, politically inclusive, and not applying litmus tests that just hurt the Democratic Party and the cause of justice in the long run.
Well, I do want to point out, I've seen the ACLU questionnaire. She did skip some questions. She
did.
Yeah, she actually chose to answer that question.
She should have skipped all of them. just said, I'm happy to comment on all your questions. She had an area for comment, and she did that sometimes very effectively, very well, but not the yes, no thing. Because people, first of all, when it comes to legislation and how you're going to vote on legislation, you really shouldn't decide way in advance. It depends on how the bill's written, depends on what's in the bill. And so to be asked like these questions that might relate to future decisions, which are often complex decisions, if I were interest groups, I understand why for their own interest, they want to ask these questions. I don't really understand what it has to do with the ACLU. A lot of the questions were just progressive questions. They didn't have anything to do with fundamental rights. There's no fundamental right for a prisoner, undocumented prisoner, to get elective surgery at taxpayer expense. That's not a fundamental right by any standard. You can say it's the right thing to do, but it's not it's not really a fundamental right. An ACLU kind of right. So people just have to think a little harder about, where to push, where not to push. I'm not saying they should stop pushing, but just to be smarter politically. And I think there are a number of progressives, including AOC, who have gotten smarter politically. There is growth that's possible, in terms of recognizing what works, what's effective politically. And that's a process that I think all of the various constituencies of the Democratic Party, however well-motivated they are and however right they are in many of these issues, should go through. And it's some of the introspection and sort of matching skepticism and idealism. So you stay skeptical of received wisdom, of easy answers, of umbrage, and also, stay idealistic. And that's all that I can. That's all I can bring to the party. Bear a little witness, and everybody else can figure out their ways to make a difference.
Well, I do want to, we got time for one more question. I just wanted to ask you before you go, before we wrap up here, you tell a story in the book about Bill Clinton. And well, you tell several, but one of them is about his reelection after the Monica Lewinsky issue had already come up. And he says the part of the book is called "They Always Get It Right," and it's about him saying, "Hey, I trust the voters; they'll get it right." And then you wrote, "I'm no longer sure that if voters have the time, they will sort it out and get it right." Can you talk about how?
Yeah. So this is to me a really important problem that we haven't talked about yet. So in 1998, on the worst day of Clinton's presidency, when his grand jury testimony was talking about intercourse or the lack thereof with Monica Lewinsky, it's all on TV. And that evening, I snuck into a reception with the president and first lady. They were in town for the UN, and Hillary was chilly, like sort of, "What are you doing here?" kind of. And he was very effusive, and he like gestured me over. And I said, "How are you holding up, Mr. President?" And he said, "I'm doing just fine. I was at the UN today, and the one of the Latin American presidents said, Mr. President, you're lucky. In our country, when they stage a coup d'etat, they use real bullets." And he said, "I'm going to win these midterm elections." And he did, which never happened before in the 6th year of presidency because of the reaction against the Republicans. And then he leaned in, and I will never forget this. I wrote an article about it in a column in Newsweek at the time, but think about it differently now. He said, "John, with enough time and information, the American people always get it right." And even then, I knew it wasn't always, but I thought that they mostly got it right. But the key part of what he said was, with enough time and information. And that's what's changed since 1998, is that we now have these siloed channels of information. We have a very powerful right-wing media. We have left the sovereignty of fact. And we're in a very dangerous place where we don't all accept common set of facts. And we're a very long way from Walter Cronkite saying, that's the way it is, November 18th, 1976, we're a long, long way from that. And we haven't figured out what we're going to do about that. But it's dangerous when so many people are fed such a steady diet of disinformation and misinformation. And I plan in the next couple of years to spend a considerable amount of time trying to figure that one out.
Well, when you do, write a book about it and come back and visit us here at the Commonwealth Club on World Affairs. Many, many thanks to you, Mr. Alter, author of American Reckoning, Inside Trump's Trial and My Own. You can pick up a copy at your local bookstore. Thank you again for joining us, viewers, listeners, and of course, Mr. Alter. We'll see you next time at the Commonwealth Club.
Thanks, Melissa.